We're going to have a bit of a chat up here for a little while, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the floor. I might throw the first question at Baroness Greenfield, if that's okay, just following from what you're saying there. Yeah. I have a son, he's age 7, he's in grade 1, and they don't really let them use calculators. And the way the principal explained it to me is they need to know why they're pushing the buttons. They need to understand these concepts before they're given the tool that will do the job for them. In the same way, do you think that there are other sorts of technologies that we need to be careful giving to children too young because they then don't learn how these things really work?
Yeah, I think of any age, really, it's an issue of understanding. And I'm sure there's educationalists here this evening who have perhaps got direct experience of that, but certainly in my own experience of science teaching, for example, it's very easy to learn the facts, to download them and to regurgitate them in an exam, and everyone is happy. But you don't actually understand. You don't understand what something is. So I think that if we are, and I hope, trying to, in education, get people to put one thing in terms of something else, to understand it, then just emphasising an action or a response is not sufficient, unless you just want to tick a box. But I think everyone, you as a parent, I'm sure, would want your child to understand. After all, that's what knowledge truly is.
James, did you?
I was just going to say, I mean, could it be that there's different types of understanding that we're starting to see? I think I look at, one of my cousins, and he finds information in a different way. You don't find the single sense of truth, and you might be aggregating things from different websites. You might be pulling. That's a different style of knowledge than maybe when you were taught to look at an encyclopedia or whatever it might be.
No, it's a different way of searching. It's not. I mean, I don't see how it is different. The only difference is if you don't join up the dots and you just keep these isolated facts, rather like in pub quizzes or Trivial Pursuits, where, to be honest, we don't put a great premium on that, or if you sit next to someone all evening, they're going to tell you facts all evening, I don't think you'd be as impressed as someone who said they were going to tell you some ideas. So the method of accessing information, and I admit we now live in an answer-rich, question-poor environment rather than the other way around, I don't think is the exciting or important issue. It's what do you do with those facts when you have them in front of you, however you've got them? What are you going to do with them?
But could it be we're getting better at synthesis rather than...
Well, at the moment, there's less evidence for that people are... you can do tests of people on how much they've understood something, and people that have read a book in a linear way perform better than people who've hypertexted, for example. Because the whole issue of the brain, it can only take so much. And if you are bombarding it with fast and furious inputs, and if the attention is fragmented because you have to multitask and evaluate a complex scenario, there's less time for joining up the dots and reflection, as you do when you read a book and you put it on linear and you stare at the wall.
Professor Cubitt.
Yeah, I think we hit the other problem I have with it is the idea that there are facts. I think there are certain things which you can take as facts in the boiling point of mercury or the existence of paedophile priests or something, but they sorry about that. They do require a certain amount of interpretation, and different orders of fact require different kinds of placing. And I think one of the things that is very, very difficult to find in the search engine society is that kind of interpretive skill.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because it's what, as I say, it's what you do with the fact, what it means to you, and it can only mean something if it's put into a conceptual framework. The simple example with my little brother, not understanding what a candle was.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's interesting about the current manifestation of the sorts of changes we've been talking about, and the idea of knowledge in your pocket, the social media revolution, which we all agree is having an enormous impact, is that it's actually diminishing people's use of search engines. It's actually changing that. So I think that, in years to come, we will look back at the period we've just been through as the great era of the search engine. We can actually see those platforms being replaced right now by much more contextualised and connected forms of information, whether, if you call it information. I agree with you, Susan, that it's not knowledge, but I would say it's a bit more than just data.
I think there's another fear about it, which is search is certainly changing. The way you can see it at the moment is the predictive texting that you get when you type into Google. It's a very wonderful thing. We are teaching Google, as a large groups of people using, in this case, English, how to do searches. So we're teaching it knowledge, in a certain sense, how to connect things up. Unfortunately, what we're teaching it is, I would hate to say the lowest common denominator, but the norms, the ordinary. It's, like those panel games or quiz games we used to have where you had to guess what was the first thing everybody said when you said the word vegetable.
Yeah, there's a horrible scenario one can think of if all experience is going to be through the cyber world, and therefore be independent of time or place, that we're all going to have the same memories and we're all going to be homogenized as people because our individual experience will be far less diverse than it has been up until now. And that is the stuff of science fiction novels, indeed just what I'm writing on at the moment. On that.
But isn't the social media that we're talking about now, the mobile sort of media, much more located precisely in time and place than some sort of 1990s style cyberspace kind of out there in nowhere.
And if anything, it allows more diversity. I mean, there's an argument you can say, which is that everybody's use of these things, that the Twitter feeds that I have and are very different to the Twitter feeds that other people have, and it's around these different choices that you have. So in the same way the brain changes and depends on the environment, the use of the media, it changes and depends on the environment as well in your previous experience.
Well, that also produces, that's the famous Cass-Sunstein argument, it produces little cyber neighbourhoods, so that all the I have no connection with race-hate sites at all, and my blog has no links to anybody who believes that George Bush was placed by God to pursue the war on terror. Likewise, the people who do believe that haven't got a connection to my blog. We live in little cyber neighbourhoods where we increasingly generate more and more enthusiasm for our own little collective set of beliefs.
And indeed, one could argue that it does distance you from the press of the real world. Everyone, I'm sure, has had the experience that we've all had of sitting in a train and there's people on the phone who are just somewhere else as they're talking because they're so monumentally indiscreet with what they're saying about their private lives. They broadcast the whole carriage. And they're ignorant of the sun on their face or the rain of that. So I think that just because you can carry it around with you doesn't mean to say you're suddenly open to your immediate senses. You're actually insulating yourself in your own silo of your cyber network.
But it is a different type of connection. And on one side, are you connecting more with people who might have a different background from you, and that's a good thing if you're getting more of a global outlook?
Yeah, but if you're not giving them a hug or looking them in the eye, it's a bit sanitised, isn't it?
That's the question.
There is an increase in autistic spectrum disorder. Autistic people are very comfortable on Second Life. And one could argue if you live in this Tom and Jerry world where actions speak louder than words and where you're not actually experiencing a three-dimensional interaction with someone, that you'll be impoverished because of it. Now, clearly it's an issue, we might not mind that, but we have to take it on board as a possibility.
I swear it's the truth that everybody under 30 has lost their peripheral vision. They never notice anybody on either side, only what's directly in front where the TV screen ought to be.
The other issue that we haven't raised while we're talking about that is the Twitter issue. What fascinates me about that, and I just want to flag it because none of us have, is the constant readout of flood of consciousness, 99% of which is not that interesting. Yeah.
Or is it a retweet of what someone else just said?
Unless it's Obama or something. But, on the whole, it's not the fact that you can do it. It's not the issue. It's more that what people do with it and how tedious and boring. It reminds me of a little child. Look at me, I'm putting on one sock. Look at me, I'm putting on another sock. Look at me, mummy. Look at me. Because if you don't look at me, I might not exist. I'm in existential crisis.
Oh, I think
but how much of this stuff on a train, if you were overhearing people, for you, would be boring as well? And I think it's very hard to try to sort of judge what's happening.
But surely the better is to have an open mind to interact with the world around you, to talk to people, to find out things about them, not to just keep bombarding people with information about yourself. Most of it not very interesting.
I think what's worse than the tedium is the fact that it's compulsory. Yeah. We absolutely must tweet, post, blog, mail, respond.
There's no time for thinking. You're on the go. I mean, what amazes me, and I'm sure some are doing it here, is this constant readout.
I'm doing it now.
Without even any reflection. It comes in, it goes out, in, really fast. And when I did a thing for the British paper at the time saying that this was what I called yuck and wow, and said about the one sock, and then I got lampooned. Apparently it got 75,000 hits on Google within 24 hours because they said yuck or wow. And there was someone putting on both socks at once saying, look, I can put two socks on simultaneously. But I think there is this attitude that, again, actions speak louder than words, that, you must be responding and doing things and interacting and in fact, turning yourself into a computer rather than someone who thinks and feels things.
Now, Dr. Moody, I know that you've got a strong interest in geospatial data and geospatial technologies, basically where things are and relating to that. How that type, most of these smartphones now have got GPS in them, people know where they are, everything knows where you are. Does that mean that we are going to become further embedded into the world around us, or is it going to remove us more from the world around us into this world where we're interacting with people somewhere else but we don't care about what's happening right there?
I think, so there's all this information. We've just been talking about this incredible world. So if those of you who haven't had a go at, looking at Twitter or the Twitter feeds, there is a lot of stuff that's happening behind the scenes, you might say, backstage. Little messages that people in the crowd are currently saying, and so there is a lot of information that's flowing around. And I think one of the things we've been talking about, how do you organise all that information? How do you get your head around it? How does your brain not explode? And there's certain ways of doing that. You can choose which conversations you want to be part of. But the other one, and I guess your point there, Adam, is it's location matters. And we're going to see this increasing focus on location as a way of sorting all the information that's around. And that's part of us and becoming, more localised ourselves, but also about, if I'm going to try to find a train timetable, I'm more likely to want the train timetable near me. And so all these services, so there's these different things like Foursquare. Foursquare is a technology where you check in, you can see who else might be around, you get little tokens if you check into the right place, you might get a discount in the shop nearby. We're seeing Facebook get into Facebook places. We're seeing, I saw recently there's 1,000 different businesses now that are all about trying to create localization and turn local products into, and these are very viable businesses, all fighting for that market of owning a little bit of the place-based world. So.
I think Sean raised an important point about the sort of economics of all this, because surely it does impact on the goods and services people require, the fact that they're going to be experiential rather than having objects or having anything with meaning. And I think it will impact very much on the workforce of the future and risk management, creativity or otherwise. And I think, as well as for education and the public sector, it's also really important for the private sector when we see the changing face of the 21st century.
Professor Cubitt, you've got an interest in public screens and public spaces. Now, obviously, there's a lot of room in there for that to interact with social media, and for what's happening in front of you can actually be happening around you as well. Where do you see that going? We've got a big screen out here in Federation Square. How do you see social media tying into things like that?
I was thinking about this question. Can I just conduct a small experiment? I want to see how many, there's a law in discussions of, concerning discussions in cyberspace that it takes a maximum of 20 steps to get to a mention of Adolf Hitler. So I'm going to see if I can do this in response to your question. Firstly, it's about the publicness of our experience. So what's extraordinary about the handheld is it's kind of a fetal curl. It's a very inward experience. We've moved from the cinema screen to the television screen to the computer screen and now to the handheld device. So it's kind of gradual curling inwards. But curiously, that's gone along with a desire to be public with everything. Privacy is clearly over. The only people who like privacy are wife-beaters and tax evaders, and everybody else is publishing their sexual exploits and everything else online. So, but what's fascinating is to see those appear in large-scale public screens where the actual publicness becomes apparent. And of course, what's fascinating about that is that it brings us from the small-scale low-res to the big-screen high-res, which is the other great tendency of digital media at the moment. The high-res. High-definition TV and the massive IMAX 3D experience and so forth, where we're invited to participate in these huge spectacles. Now, one of the things about the spectacle, of course, is all modelled on Nuremberg.
You're getting closer. He's getting closer. Now, the way this works is the first person to call someone else Hitler loses. We're getting closer. Please continue.
I think it is the fearsome thing that I mentioned before about the compulsory nature of communication. It's compulsory to have an identity which is expressed, however, through standardized portals. And that this huge participation makes us all proud to be part of the 500 million Facebook people, the 200 million Twitterers and so forth. It's a bit like, being really impressed when your favourite rock star gets a best-selling album and you think, yes! It's the enjoyment of being part of a huge tidal wave of normalness. However, the normalness that's involved here is peculiarly what I would call custom consumerism. Our identities are about how we can consume in a customised fashion. So we all have the smartphone, but it does matter, as you said in opening up, whether it's Android or Apple. And it matters whether it's got a pink sleeve on it or not.
Oh, very much, yeah. It's very tribal.
Yeah, I'd like to read a quote, which is very short, and in itself you might think just boring. Its interest lies in who said it, who I'll say at the end. I worry that the level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming rapidity of information, is in fact affecting cognition. It is affecting deeper thinking. I still believe that sitting down and reading a book is the best way to really learn something, and I worry that we are losing that. Who said that? The CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt.
That's why there's Google Books.
Yes.
Yeah.
I might throw a question at you, Dr. Thomas, and then we might throw it open to sorry, I called you Dr. Thomas. It's Professor Thomas. I've been getting my professors and Thomases. Okay. I'm the only person here without a title. That's all I have to remember. What's all this mean for privacy? We'll take Facebook as an example. By default, it shares a lot about you, but it's not that hard if you understand it to go in and change the settings. Do young people not understand privacy, not care about privacy, or do they just think that the idea of privacy is outmoded and everything is now out in the public?
Well, actually, the research on this is extensive, and it turns out to be a bit more complicated than that. I think there's actually a lot of evidence that young users of Facebook and social media sites have in fact a reasonably sophisticated understanding of privacy, of the sort of settings and the changes. And so there's been a number of studies which have explored that. I think that we're talking about a number of different things when we talk about the problem of privacy. Some of what we're talking about are what I mentioned earlier in the talk, what you'd actually describe as information accidents, things that happen, the unexpected things, the mistakes that you make. And it's true, quite clearly, that sites like Facebook make those accidents more possible than ever, and sometimes those accidents can be catastrophic, can be really serious and really difficult. But there are also those very alarming occasions where firms like Google seem to deliberately accumulate and capture information which they must know they shouldn't. And that is a serious issue for governments, not just for users.
James? I also think, I mentioned this earlier, privacy, I think we shouldn't underestimate the level of sophistication for a lot of people. And there is privacy as well as why do you use these things? There's a transaction involved. You put your stuff online in exchange for something else, whether it's recognition or, to encourage other people to put online or whatever it might be, but we're seeing privacy as a transaction a lot more. And we're also seeing that, and in fact, I predict that there will be ways of monetising that even more. I think that'll be in the next 10 years, people will find a way of creating a business around privacy in its own right, and then we'll probably see even more levels of privacy. So I'm not sure that privacy is dead. The issue is we're in a transition phase. But I think in general it's the same thing for all of these different networks. Why are people using them? Well, quite simply, they're getting something out in between. I once saw a T-shirt that had a Venn diagram and had narcissism and stalking. And under narcissism there was blogging, stalking there was Facebook, and right in the middle there was Twitter. But it's sort of, that's not right, I don't think. I think the real issue is that people get something out of it. From my Twitter feed I get news. From my Facebook friends I get community, whatever it might be.
There's real value there. I think that's absolutely right.
I think we should be very careful. As you say, we're in a transitional stage, and my concern is for the next generation, for whom there may not be such a robust sense of identity for the reasons that we've said. And if you don't have a strong identity, you won't need privacy. And I think that we are being complacent if we assume everyone's going to be in our image for next generations to come, because human nature is not inviolate, it is vulnerable, and it is shaped by the environment. And if the environment is this different, then I think we have to put in place the checks and balances, the various scenarios, and decide how we are going to shape it, rather than just let it all happen and then cry foul.
I think that's right in so many ways. Certainly I've overstated my case. Privacy isn't dead, it's just very unwell.
It could be done, yes. It's on its deathbed.
Yes, it's particularly sickly.
More talk about privacy now than there has been for decades.
Because it was always assumed. It was a given in the past.
Yeah, but it's only when these things emerge as problems that we really understand them.
Yeah. But I think when you look at the scale of the data involved, like in one day, ordinary business day's traffic for AT&T, a single telco, is 18.7 petabytes of data. So we're not talking about a particularly close management of individual phone calls. It's simply not possible. There is not that much storage on the planet. So the question is what is no longer really about personal privacy in quite the same way, I think. It's what the sociologists call biopolitics. It's about a statistical and probabilistic management of whole populations. And that's a far more interesting aspect. I think once we put together the ubiquitous computing networks which join human, natural, and technological objects together into large networks, then we have also to start thinking about the new modes of politics that emerge there, and in the information economy and the database politics of the present. I think what we're looking at is a very new mode of politics, which, for my part, I actually think is either terrifyingly post-identity or revolutionarily, marvellously post-individualistic. After bourgeois individualism, perhaps we do get a new
There's a neo-Marxism, cyber-Marxism.
Yes, a new commonwealth, exactly.
I certainly think the issue of work is very interesting because as there's no longer a premium on being mobile or strong, people of any age can carry on working. And already, as you know, in Europe, everyone's very anxious to put the pension age up so we can save money. They'll soon latch on to say it stimulates the brain and it's good for you. So my own view is that soon what's going to happen is you'll grow up, you'll have a homogenous life, and then you'll die. And during that homogenous life, anyone of any age or sexual orientation will be reproductive, so that will blur the generations as well. Everyone will look pretty much the same because everyone will be very healthy, and there will be a kind of tendency with genetic manipulations and so on to a norm. So we'll look the same, we'll think the same, we'll have the same past, we won't have generational divide, and then we'll just die. And that'll be life, that'll be what human beings are. We'll be going back to being like goldfish, actually, I think.
On that high point, that's probably a good place to maybe throw open for questions. If people want to make their way to the microphones, I think we might also take questions from Twitter as well. We've got a microphone over here and a microphone over here.
Thank you to all of you for coming along and sharing your thoughts with us. Baroness Greenfield mentioned that social media is a complex issue and it needs to be tackled piece by piece to assess whether it's good or bad. And I was interested in your thoughts on what social media means for politics and political discourse. Thanks.
Certainly. I'm not going to answer it for you.
Okay. I thought it was... so one of the very interesting issues was Obama's campaign. Chris Hughes from Facebook gave up 1.5 years from Facebook, one of the co-founders. And I think that made an astonishing contribution to Obama's success. So if we're talking about politics and accessing various constituencies and getting messages out there, obviously it's a hugely powerful medium. Another example for education is MIT, for example, putting all their courses out there for anyone to be able to download and benefit from, as long as they don't actually want to register for the degree. So I think that in terms of getting out to people, it's very, very powerful, but that in itself might be rather sinister if one thinks about people being very vulnerable, very impressionable, if you've got them in a state of excitement and arousal, as I would argue that you can have, and this gets onto Nuremberg and Hitler in 2 seconds easily, and how easy it is to manipulate other people if you have a rather cynical and savvy minority who are pulling the strings. The other issues I'm concerned about is when one does flag potential problems, how much that might be offset by the same kind of mentality that was hostile, let's say, to smoking in the 50s, where it wasn't in anyone's economic interest to find problems with something that people were enjoying and other people were making money out of. So I think these are some of the issues, both good and bad, that go beyond my own domain, which is neuroscience, and what it does to a person, in terms of how society is going to use it and how it can be either a corrupting influence or indeed a beneficial one.
I think just to add one little comment there, I've been increasingly irritated, although my sympathies tend to be rather with the Green Party, I'm increasingly irritated at getting no reply emails from them. This is not the principle of the internet. It's about interaction. And I think that's why the social network media and, for example, Government 2.0, well, Government 2.0 is getting it wrong. It thinks it's a way of getting us to fill in forms more efficiently. It's not about opening up to dialogue and debate. That's what this offers, and it's not happening.
Yeah, I think the crucial issue is it makes everyone feel important. You have a voice, you're listened to, there's a response immediately, your view counts, it can access and amplify out to vast audiences that are unprecedented, and I think that is something that gives people a sense of self-worth and of meaning, and hence its power. Yeah.
Hi. My question was towards the rise of smartphones and technology. How do you think it's going to? Do you think it's going to divide people that are not into this kind of, social path?
There's two types of divides that could occur. I mean, there is one which is the digital divide, as it's often called, between a developed world and developing world country. Although one of the things we're seeing is that might not be the case, where there's 25% of people in Kenya now use mobile money through a thing called M-Pesa. Right? That's far beyond the number of people that use mobile money in Australia. So that's a question. That's a sort of divide, but definitely the benefits of science and technology in that space. The second one, which I think is more interesting, is generational divides and who may or may not be able to use these particular pieces of technology. And because it's happening maybe a little more rapidly than we've seen in the past, that we are seeing the intensification of innovation, maybe there's less time to catch up. Now, I take a view that really, this digital natural convergence, this was the book that I wrote, it was the sixth wave. There's been 5 waves of innovation since the Industrial Revolution, and they start with milling and steam, and they start with a lot of disruption and end with a global depression. I believe the global financial crisis we've seen was the end of the 5th wave, which was information and communications technology. The 6th will be all about resources, resource efficiency, and as part of that it is digital and natural convergence. And if that's the case, this is inevitable. There's no choice about whether we're going to start to see more and more information. That's the technology trajectory we're on. The question is how we apply it. So for me, and then the real question is, how do we make sure that people keep up?
No, please, you go first. Yeah.
I was just going to add on that, the issue around the digital divide. I think smartphones make computing and the internet more accessible than they've ever been before. They are reducing the digital divide because they are cheaper and more accessible and easier to use than any other computing device that we've... Sorry. Is that better?
Hey.
Okay, I'm just making the point that smartphones... I'll start again. So smartphones, I think, are actually assisting to narrow that digital divide, if that is what we are concerned about. They are cheaper and more accessible and easier to use than the computers that people have used in the past. The digital divide is getting smaller, partly because of that phenomenon and reducing costs, but that doesn't mean that it's going to become less of a problem. In fact, it may become more of a problem as more and more of us rely on high-speed networks and this kind of technology. Then those who do not use them and those who do not have access to them may become, more and more relatively disadvantaged. Whether or not you think that accessibility and uptake of technology like smartphones or not is a good thing is a different matter.
One of the problems about the smart energy, for example, which is one of the great uses of ubiquitous computing, it would be really fantastic if it wasn't already employed specifically for the marketisation, for example, of electric power, so that the classic example was the California rolling blackouts when Enron was shipping electricity out of California in order to create particular kinds of political and economic chaos. If in terms of digital divide, if you have smart metering, for example, but it's in the hands of a small number of markets, for example in Mumbai, where they're beginning to introduce it. But there is a huge fight going on between the municipal power providers, Reliance as a commercial outfit, and Tata as the major transmitter of electricity. And they're fighting over who gets to control what. Then you actually do get chaotic systems, which invariably avoid going to slums and actually create more havoc than they potentially cure. It's one part of a very complex solution, but the digital divide remains that if knowledge and skills, as well as the actual kit, remain in hands. It's not only that you have access to a mobile phone in Kenya, it's also that you have to know how to use it, that you have the level of service that you can use, and you have the knowledge and ability to be able to join it up into knowledge rather than data.
Yeah, I think as the generations are unfolding, so the emphasis is increasingly on the experience you're having at the moment, and that ties in a bit with what James was saying in terms of resources and resource management. I don't think any more people are going to want, as in when I was growing up, every lady in England wanted a fur coat, for example, because that would say something about you. Yeah? And I think now we're shifting away from things that say something about you to things that make you feel a certain way. Even if it's you're buying a product, it's how you feel when you're buying that product, rather than just the intrinsic value of the product, what it says about you. So I think we're seeing a shift there, where something that gives you an experience, many types of experiences, is going to be more desired or important than perhaps other things, and so you'll have that. The other issue about the mobile phone is that I think it's only a matter of time before it's embedded in clothing or earrings or something like that. We see how small they've got now. And eventually, subcutaneous, yeah. So that it has an appeal because it's part of our bodies in a way that a laptop never can be. It's your friend that goes with you everywhere. You feel twitchy if someone else holds it, whereas if someone sits at your laptop, you don't feel so uncomfortable, you know. So I think you feel it as part of your body, and soon it will be increasingly intimate with you. It's only a matter of time before it's in your clothes, and then in your, as I say, invasively. And I think then it will be, that we are very much into the cyber interfacing more than person-to-person interfacing.
But this is a good thing, I think, in the sense that shift from product to service to experience, that's the sort of hierarchy up the value chain. Well, the thing about the service and the experience is you can actually decouple the value created from resource consumption. So in that broad area, it's sort of like the shift from the thing I own to be the status symbol to the number of friends I have on Facebook becoming the status symbol. And that is a way, I mean, if we really look at the resource consumption space, we are butting up against scarcity in certain areas. And so a way of decoupling economic growth from resource consumption is by using all these digital technologies.
Yeah, well, you can imagine a world where people don't drive cars anymore, they don't pollute the atmosphere, they don't go anywhere, they sit in their rooms just going yuck and wow, playing computer games all day.
No,
that's
I don't think that's not what I'm
saying. The planet might be saved that way.
But you can be more local. You can walk to places. It doesn't have to be a blancmange of
yes, I'm sure,
everything.
Because you won't need to go anywhere, because everything will be virtual. So, but this is the world. Now, the question is this the world we want? And we have to use the technologies to deliver whether we want this or not.
The problem partly is that we haven't got enough raw materials on the planet for everybody on the planet to have the level of equipment that we enjoy in the developed world. There simply isn't enough lithium or indium or lanthanoids or anything else to make that many MP3 players and cameras and everything else. It simply isn't going to happen. And just to add to the awfulness of it all, the same materials are absolutely required to make our ecologically friendly devices like hybrid cars or photovoltaics. So we've got a genuine resource problem, even forgetting the fact that we've got an artificially low oil price at the moment. We've got some very, very serious problems. Indium is now, I think, 16 times the price of gold. It is so rare. There are supposed to be about 8 years' worth left. And that's almost all in recyclables, which of course means recycling villages in Nigeria, Ghana and other places where, of course, working conditions are the highest in the world.
But that's where these things become interesting. Yeah. You look at what these things can enable. There's a company called GoGet, which is a car share company in Sydney. 10 families use a single vehicle. now. And it's basically because they've enabled mobile phones and the things can track where the cars are and all that sort of stuff. So your business models that we had in the past when we were talking about resource consumption don't necessarily apply. You can look at efficiency from these.
I might cut you off there so we can go to the next question.
Okay. My question's about social networking and addiction. Just a short little example. The last, we have a year 11s and 12s, the last years of secondary school. I had a group of students say to me that they were going to take like a 40-hour famine pact, whereby to enable them to study, they had to make a pact with each other that they couldn't get themselves on Facebook, and they actually didn't think they'd be able to do it. I'll leave that there.
Well, can I do a brief comment on that?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants a reference, but there's a very good, albeit somewhat technical review that came out in September this year in a very high-impact neuroscience journal called Neuron by someone called Bavalier, B-A-V-A-L-I-E-R, and colleagues. And the whole thrust of this is showing the evidence for three things: distraction, violence, and addiction growing in children. As a neuroscientist, I can tell you that if you are excited and aroused, as you frequently may be when you're playing computer games and are encouraged to do, there's a release of a chemical called dopamine in the brain, and we know that dopamine is linked to reward processes. It's also the final common path of release with psychotropic drugs of addiction. So I'm not saying that every time you go, everyone goes on a screen, they're going to get addicted, but the neuroscientists are on the case for seeing a link and tracing the possible connection, also that between these well-known pathways and chemical processes with the kind of environment and how that could be precipitated with the screen.
I think that all that said, we have been here before. I remember reading a study from the early 1980s, which was a study of American college students where they removed the students' remote controls for their TVs for a week and undertook this sort of study of, well, how much suffering did this cause? And it turned out that the students who didn't have access to their remote controls for their TVs reported severe and serious pain not having access to this. And in fact, about half of them in the study, in fact, stole and sneaked their remote controls back. So, I mean, this is a sort of recurrent kind of theme in the literature.
It doesn't make it any less valid, though.
I think it asks some questions about it. Yeah.
Just a question. A lot of the people who are here would have grown up during the transition from non-internet through to internet and now onto Facebook. So they're, you could say, looking for an identity online. What does that mean for their children and the role models for them?
Oh, look, I've got a 1-year-old baby, and there's always a dilemma about whether you create the Facebook page already or not. Look, the nature of identity is a really good one and a really good question. And I think, you know, how does your identity evolve as you evolve in your particular, your life stages? And I think there'll be a really interesting thing about when Facebook, and it looks like Facebook's on that trajectory to become, where a lot of people have. They might win the dominant design, as they talk about in the innovation speak, just like a AC Power or a Microsoft Windows won the dominant design challenges in the past. Then Facebook's going to start wondering in 10 years' time and having all these challenges about how does your identity shift. And can you put your dog on Facebook and what it actually means and all that sort of stuff. So for me, that's the post-transition phase thing when everybody does, and one way or another, have a Facebook page. What are they actually, what is that going to mean when you want to start changing identity as part of it? Or do you just have to kill that and then start a new one? I've seen quite a few friends already doing that. So.
Well, a neuroscientist's take on identity, if you're looking at brain mechanisms and processes, would be that as your brain cell connections are growing in a unique configuration that no one else has ever had for 100,000 years, that we've stalked the planet. So slowly you go from being a one-way street where you get bombarded by senses as a small child into where those abstract sensations then start to make connections, and you go to a so-called cognitive take on the world. So instead of seeing an abstract visual pattern accompanied by textures and colours and smells, you see your mother, and your mother will mean something to you that she doesn't mean to anyone else because of the associations and connections that she forges. And as you start to accumulate in your life narrative a past, and then you start to contemplate a future, so you start to become individual, you start to have a personalized brain, and it's that personalization of the brain that I would call the mind. Now, if sadly those connections get dismantled, then you retrace the steps of being like childhood again. You go back into the booming, buzzing confusion, and that's what dementia is, for example. But there's other ways in which you can do that. The traditional ways of wine, women and song, drugs and sex and rock and roll, are where you deliberately dismantle or disable your connections by using drugs that distort the chemicals, or you'll put yourself in an environment that, if you look at the typical nightclub, is stripped of all cognitive content because it's just a booming, buzzing confusion, or you do downhill skiing or sex. And in all cases, we say, we've blown our minds, we're out of our minds, we've let ourselves go, a very interesting one. We're having a sensational time. No one ever says, come on, let's go out and have a really good cognitive time now. Let's go and have a cognitive... So it's part of human nature in terms of identity, on one hand to develop an identity, at the same time to abrogate it from time to time. And my fear is if you put yourself in an environment that is persistently stripped of cognitive content, or less so, that is characterized by sensations and strong inputs, you might be skewing that otherwise traditional balance in human brain.
We might take a question from Twitter, then another question from the audience, then that might be about time to wrap it up, I think.
Hi. While the panelists are engaging very intense debate on stage, I've been watching very intense discussion in the Twitter sphere. And in fact, the hashtag KCWS has become the most trending topic on Twitter for tonight.
Woohoo!
Which is ahead of big votes, the upcoming election, as well as Christmas.
We're bigger than Christmas.
Yeah. So thanks for everyone's contribution. And a special thanks to James Moody, who is on stage, but is also at the same time engaged in Twitter discussion. So
that's cognitive rhythm.
So I got a question from IPHSO, which is the person's Twitter handle. So any views on how to leverage social media for social good? Anybody? Please.
Look, I can think of one immediately. I don't know if you guys have got... There's a group that's actually trying to create small business models in Africa, and what they do is there's transcription and translation services. So if you're a business, you might want to be translating if you're a law firm, first of all, you might want to be transcribing a particular piece of text. What this business will do, it will chop it up into 20-second chunks, and they might send it out to 5 people. And you can actually get the message on your phone, you can listen to it, you can transcribe it. If all 5 people give the same answer, then it takes that as that's actually the piece of transcription. That's very effective for transcribing these areas. The same for translation. If there's local, small languages that you want to actually transcribe a website into that local language or otherwise, that can actually happen as well, and that can all be done with text. So there are little business models, and they're very much Text Eagle, I think, is the name of that business. They're all designed with a social conscious in mind. That's about actually creating local opportunities for people in developing countries. So I think there is a very strong... Well, there's lots of opportunity in this space to explore things like that.
I'd like to turn that around because it's such a wide question and say it's not so much the solution but the problem that we need to articulate. And I'm sure, given the digital technologies are so clever and so powerful, it's not so much could there be one, but what is the problems that we can specify that they can then cater for. And I think it might be worthwhile, not now, but in order to answer your question, to think about what kinds of things are problems that we would like to resolve and what's our priority for doing that. And then you go to the IT people, because I think it's that way around rather than the technologies that need a problem. We need to articulate what the problem is.
And that's absolutely right. There's some startling tales of bad ICT for development, information communication technology for development projects. There are some startlingly good ones. One, for example, is establishing communication between prostitutes working on the major trunk roads in India in HIV prevention through establishing networks. Partly it identifies carriers because otherwise these poor women have absolutely no way of knowing. I think the example of the Burmese news feeds during the uprisings against the generals is a fantastic and inspiring one, and many others like that. More generally, I think, going back to something Julian was talking about, the rise of locative media, the use of mobile media in particular, to generate information around all sorts of things, from food trade, to a marvellous one called Pigeon Blog, which uses devices strapped to pigeons, feeding down to GPS devices, measuring atmospheric pollution over major cities. And it's an extraordinary project and very much empowers people. On a broader level, I think to reverse your way around one more time is to say there are certain tools that we're not using. So when we're talking social networks, we tend to talk about the big established portals, but we have some very fine tools. One that I particularly like and is used by almost none of the universities in Melbourne is Moodle, which is a free learning environment and is extraordinarily good, free, open access, open source. And we all, of course, use multi-million-dollar expensive ones that don't have the same functionality. Wiki, not Wikipedia, but wikis are fantastically useful. I'm involved with one, for example, developing ecological social science, and it's a particularly powerful tool. The other one is Ning, which if you haven't come across it, you really should look up if you sort of want to get out of Facebook. Ning is a tool set up by Andreessen, who was the founder of Mozilla and Netscape, which is a tool for creating your own social network. And it's entirely customizable, open source, open access as well. Those sorts of tools provide us with very small, potentially very local, or very specialist long-tail kinds of activities that may be politicized or socially oriented or ethically oriented or directed to particular communities, but are extraordinarily potent ways of getting outside these things. I think the other thing in response to the previous question was the generational difference is people who grew up with the media, the new media, know how code works. The more net native people become, the less they know what goes on under the bonnet. My students now, I get 5 in 500 who know what a cookie is. You know, they're profoundly ignorant of really important parts of the technology they use every day. That sort of technical knowledge needs to be written into school curricula along with media ethics and responsibility.
Just very quickly to add to the discussion, I mean, I really agree about the need for these sort of social good solutions where they exist. They are invariably not driven by the technology, but by careful thought and by the people who are on the ground and embedded in these situations themselves. I'd add there are innumerable examples of open source and other projects of the kind that Sean's been talking about and many others, which bring communities together in new ways, which address problems of social isolation, exclusion and remoteness in new ways. I think the really hard question, the question I wonder about, is why these solutions aren't more widely known about and why they aren't more widely used.
Do we have time for one more question from the room, if there's someone from the room? Or?
A comment and then a question.
Okay.
First of all, thanks for answering the question from Twitter. I'll just give you guys an update. Before I was saying KCWS was the most trending topic in Melbourne. It's actually now climbed to the most trending topic in Australia. Thanks.
Excellent.
Good work, people.
There's been much discussion of how social media is highly interactive, but there's been little direct address of also how fast it is and how a key quality of it is that it's instantaneous. What does that mean for the quality of debate and decision-making made using that media, and particularly in terms of economic decisions, especially linked to the fact that we may no longer handle money in our hands?
Good question.
Yeah.
A very good question. And it's one that goes back to the early days of computing. The problem with early warning systems in the American military, where the computers were very rapidly developed in the 1960s, was that you could get data about an incoming attack and arms responding automatically much faster than a political decision could be made. That means from then on we have been on the brink of what at least one commentator refers to as the information catastrophe. It's a phrase you used.
Well, one solution to that is to lose the codes, which apparently President Clinton did for 3 or 4 weeks without anybody quite realising.
Oh, behind the couch.
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue because, as usual, there's an offset between quality and quantity. And if something's very fast, then you don't have time for reflection. As I say, when you read a book, you put the book down and stare at the wall, because what you're doing there is the incoming information is being ticked off against the checks and balances of an ever more extensive conceptual framework. And we say, I need time to think about this, I need to think it through. Often you say, I need to write it down in order to marshal your thoughts and processes properly. And if you are being hectored by the screen into giving a response immediately, although that might bring out certain mental agility skills, it's not bringing out deep understanding. And I do fear that if you apply that to interactions with people, you're not actually thinking about what they're saying or giving a sympathetic or empathetic reply necessarily, because the premium is instead on replying quickly in perhaps a rather stereotyped way.
And I think it's very much worth recognising that although in some senses everything is accelerating, it's a two-speed world. It's very, very swift business to leave Australia by boat. But arriving in Australia by boat, especially if you hit one of the northern shores, is really a much slower process. It takes me up to 7 days to transfer money from New Zealand to Australia. However, you can take $100 billion out of the world economy in 24 hours. So it is clearly a rather different set of accelerations depending where exactly you are. There is, on a more serious note, however, I think one of the critical questions is about this quality of information and news in particular, because that obviously is real-time, 24/7 nowadays. How long do you have to check that an incoming report is true or false? And if it's spin or it bears any kind of reality, you have, in general, 20 minutes trip time.
So if I look at it from the whole of system perspective over 60 years, let's do that, 30 years back and 30 years front, the last 30 years has been all about transaction cost, right? That was that fifth wave of innovation. We were removing transactions from the system. If you wanted to buy a book, it might have taken you 2 hours to go and pick up go to a bookstore, buy a book. Then now you could do it in 5 minutes. You go online and get the book. So we were taking transaction costs out of the system. That meant everything sped up. The issue is that when you've got all these things speeding up and it is hard to handle it, how do you actually make the decision quickly? The question is whether the next 30 years will be actually when we start to understand the whole system, when we can have the processing power in our computers and models to actually understand what's going on with the landscape and the environment. So for me, we're probably in that midpoint at the moment between when things sped up a lot and then when we had the ability to actually really understand it. In 30 years' time, it might be a very different picture.
And another issue with things happening quickly, if things happen quickly, you get used to expecting something to happen quickly. And I think it's rather telling that there's been a threefold increase in prescriptions for Ritalin. That's a drug used for attention deficit disorder over the last 15 years in many countries. Now, could it be the doctors are prescribing more liberally? It's possible. Could it be that we're medicalising the condition? Possible. And not mutually exclusive with that is it that we're mandating a shorter attention span by requiring faster reactions and very fast and frequent stimuli coming in, all of which would, again, put a premium on speed rather than on content.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening. We'll need to wrap it up there. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, for their contributions to the discussion. I'd also like to thank our four panellists, Dr. James Moody, Baroness Susan Greenfield, Professor Sean Cubitt and Professor Julian Thomas. They're out of order on the sheet. I'd also like to thank the City of Melbourne and especially their Knowledge Week and Knowledge Summit team led by Helen Steele. I should also thank the Future Leaders and their director, Dr. Helen Sykes. Just a final reminder that the clipboards are circulating in sign-up lists at the rear of the room. You can also join the mailing list by emailing melbourne.conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. Thank you once again for attending and have a good evening.